Hey everyone, before we dive into this unbelievable story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let me tell you about how our HOA president tried to secretly sell a piece of our family's land and the chaos that followed. Living in Cedar Grove Estates wasn't always a nightmare. In fact, when we first moved here 5 years ago, it felt like we'd found the perfect slice of suburban paradise. I still remember the day we pulled up to our house, a beautiful colonial with a sprawling backyard that backed up to a wooded area. My dad, David, had this huge grin on his face as he unlocked the front door for the first time. Mom, Jennifer, was already planning where she'd plant her garden, and my little brother Tommy couldn't wait to explore every corner of our new home. The property came with something special, an additional quarter-acre lot adjacent to our main property. Dad had specifically chosen this house because of that extra land. "This is an investment in our future, Emily," he'd told me, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Maybe someday we'll build a guest house for Grandma and Grandpa, or maybe it'll help put you through college." That extra lot meant something to our family. It was more than just empty space. It was possibility. Our neighbors seemed friendly, enough at first. The Millers next door brought over a homemade apple pie, and Maria Sanchez from across the street helped Mom with gardening tips. The neighborhood had that perfect balance. People were friendly, but respected each other's privacy. We'd wave hello during morning walks, chat during community events, but nobody was overly nosy or intrusive. The HOA meetings were pretty standard back then, discussions about seasonal decorations, lawn maintenance, and community events. The old president, Mr. Thompson, was reasonable and fair. He understood that a community was about people, not just rules and regulations. Those first few years were peaceful. We maintained both our main property and the extra lot meticulously. Dad would mow it regularly, and we'd even planted some flowering bushes along the border to make it look nice. Everything changed when Victoria Reynolds moved into the neighborhood last year. Within months, she'd managed to get herself elected as HOA president, running on a platform of neighborhood beautification and property value protection. We should have seen the warning signs when she started implementing stricter rules about everything from mailbox colors to the exact height grass needed to be cut. But none of us could have predicted what she'd try to pull with our extra lot. It started with small comments at community meetings. "Unused lots are an eyesore," she'd say, or "empty properties attract unwanted elements." We didn't think much of it at first. Our lot wasn't unused, it was part of our property, properly maintained and cared for. Besides, we had plans for it. Dad had just started discussing with an architect about building that guest house we'd always talked about. Then came that morning in early spring. I was getting ready for school when I heard Mom gasp from the kitchen. Dad rushed in, still in his work clothes, having just returned from his night shift at the hospital. Mom's hands were shaking as she held a letter. "They're saying our lot is abandoned property," she said, her voice trembling. "Victoria's claiming we haven't maintained it and that it's become a neighborhood hazard. They're planning to sell it." Dad snatched the letter, his face growing redder with each line he read. The letter claimed that under some obscure HOA bylaw, unmaintained abandoned properties could be reclaimed by the association and sold for the benefit of the community. They'd already listed it with a real estate agent. "This is ridiculous," Dad exploded, slamming the letter down on the counter. "We've owned that land for 5 years. We maintain it. We pay taxes on it. They can't just sell it." But Victoria Reynolds was about to show us just how far she was willing to go to get her way. And we were about to learn that fighting back would take more than just anger and determination. We needed a plan, and thankfully, we had a secret weapon they didn't know about. My Uncle Frank, a retired real estate lawyer who'd seen his fair share of HOA battles. That letter was just the beginning. The very next day, while Dad was sleeping after his night shift, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of our house. Victoria Reynolds stepped out, dressed like she was heading to a corporate board meeting rather than a neighborhood visit. She wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit followed her, clutching a leather briefcase. Later, we'd learn this was Richard Bennett, a member of the HOA board who worked as a real estate developer. I watched from my bedroom window as they walked onto our extra lot, pointing at different areas and making notes. The audacity of it made my blood boil. This was our property, and they were treating it like it was already theirs to sell. Mom noticed too, and I could see her hands trembling as she dialed Dad's number to wake him up. Dad came downstairs looking exhausted, but his eyes snapped alert when he saw what was happening. He marched outside, still in his wrinkled scrubs, from his hospital shift. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" His voice carried across the yard, causing several neighbors to peek out their windows. Victoria turned slowly, that practiced HOA president smile plastered on her face. "David, good morning. We're just conducting a standard property assessment. As per Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws, we have the right to inspect any property that's been reported as potentially abandoned or neglected." "Abandoned?" Dad's voice rose in disbelief. "We mow this lot every week. We planted those bushes. We pay our taxes. How exactly is this abandoned?" Richard Bennett stepped forward, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into our perfectly maintained grass. "Mr. Anderson, according to our records, this lot has shown no significant development progress in 5 years. The HOA charter specifically states that undeveloped lots cannot remain vacant indefinitely." Mom had joined us by then, her face flushed with anger. "We have plans for this lot. We're in talks with an architect about building a guest house. You can't just decide to sell our property." "Actually," Victoria's smile turned cold, "we can. The bylaws are quite clear about this. Undeveloped lots pose a risk to property values. We've had complaints about this space becoming an eyesore." "Complaints?" I couldn't help but interject. "From who? We maintain this lot better than some people maintain their actual yards." I was thinking specifically of Victoria's own Browning lawn, but I kept that observation to myself. Victoria's eyes narrowed at my intervention. "Young lady, this is an adult discussion, but since you asked, the complaints are confidential. We protect our residents' privacy." Dad stepped between Victoria and me, his voice low and controlled. Despite his obvious anger, "Show me these bylaws. Show me exactly where it says you can sell someone's private property without their consent." Richard opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick document. "Section 12.4, paragraph B," he said, pointing to a dense block of text. "The association reserves the right to reclaim and repurpose abandoned or neglected properties for the benefit of the community after proper notice has been given." Dad snatched the document, his medical training helping him quickly scan through the complex legal language. "This is about abandoned houses and actually neglected properties. This doesn't apply to a maintained empty lot that's part of our property." "That's your interpretation," Victoria said smoothly. "Ours differs, and as the HOA board, we have the authority to make these decisions. The sale is already in process. We're offering you fair market value, of course." "We're not selling." Mom's voice was firm. "This is our property, and you have no right to sell it." Victoria's fake smile finally dropped. "I was afraid you'd be difficult about this. The buyers are very interested in this location. They're planning to build something that will greatly benefit our community. You're being selfish, holding on to land you're clearly not using." "Selfish?" Dad's voice rose again. "It's our property. We bought it, we maintain it, we pay taxes on it. You can't just decide to sell it because someone made you a good offer." "We'll see about that," Victoria replied, her tone icy. "You'll be receiving formal documentation from our attorneys. I suggest you review it carefully. Fighting this will only cost you money and cause unnecessary stress. Be reasonable, David. Take the money and let the community benefit from this space." As they walked away, Dad was already on the phone. "Frank, it's David. Remember when you said to call if we ever had HOA troubles? Well, we need your help. They're trying to sell our land." That night, our usually quiet house was filled with tension. Mom and Dad sat at the kitchen table with Uncle Frank, who'd driven over immediately after Dad's call. Papers were spread everywhere. Property deeds, HOA documents, tax records, and architectural plans we'd been working on for the guest house. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Uncle Frank muttered, reviewing the HOA bylaws. "They're trying to twist a clause meant for actually abandoned properties to steal your land. The fact that they're already in talks with buyers before even properly notifying you. That's not just unethical, it's potentially illegal." "Can they really do this?" Mom asked, her voice small.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Can they just take our land?" Uncle Frank leaned back in his chair, his years of legal experience showing in his thoughtful expression. "No, they can't. But they're counting on you not knowing that, or not being willing to fight it. This Victoria Reynolds, she's used to getting her way, isn't she?" Dad nodded grimly. "Since she became president, it's been one thing after another. But this is different. This is our property, our investment in our future." "Well," Uncle Frank smiled for the first time that evening, "I think it's time to teach Ms. Reynolds a lesson about property rights. First thing tomorrow, we're filing an injunction to stop any potential sale. Then we're going to dig into every detail of how this sale came about. Something tells me there's more to this story than they're telling us." As I listened from the stairs, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and hope. The anger was at Victoria and her attempt to steal our land, but the hope came from knowing we weren't going to take this lying down. Uncle Frank's confidence was contagious, and for the first time since that morning, I saw Mom and Dad's shoulders relax slightly. The next few days would prove that this fight was just beginning, and Victoria Reynolds had no idea what she'd started when she decided to target our family. But that's a story for the next part. The morning after our confrontation with Victoria, we discovered just how deep this conspiracy went. Uncle Frank had spent the night digging through county records and making calls to his old contacts in real estate law. What he uncovered made our blood run cold. "David, Jennifer, you need to see this," Uncle Frank called from our dining room table, which had become his makeshift legal office. Spread before him were stacks of documents, his laptop open to the county property records website. "I found out who the potential buyers are, and you're not going to believe this." Dad, still in his scrubs from another night shift, leaned over Uncle Frank's shoulder. Mom sat down, clutching her coffee mug like a lifeline. The rest of us gathered around, even Tommy, who was usually more interested in his video games than family discussions. "Silverleaf Development Corporation," Uncle Frank pointed to a document. "They've been buying up properties all across the county, but here's the interesting part. Guess who sits on their board of directors?" "Victoria," Mum guessed, but Uncle Frank shook his head. "Close. Richard Bennett, our friendly neighborhood HOA board member. And look at this. His wife's company is the real estate firm handling the sale. They're keeping it all in the family, so to speak." Dad's face darkened. "So this isn't just about community beautification. They're trying to profit from our land." "It gets worse," Uncle Frank continued, pulling up another document. "I did some digging into similar cases in neighboring communities. Silverleaf has a pattern. They target properties through HOA pressure, buy them below market value, and flip them for massive profit. They've done this in 3 other neighborhoods in the last 2 years. But how do they get away with it? I asked, my voice shaking with anger. Surely someone must have fought back. Uncle Frank nodded grimly. Most people give in. The HOA threatens massive fines, legal action, liens on their property. It's easier to take the lowball offer than fight. But this time, he smiled, they picked the wrong family to mess with. Just then, the doorbell rang. Maria Sanchez, our neighbor from across the street, stood there looking worried. David, Jennifer, I had to come tell you. I was at the coffee shop this morning and I overheard Victoria and Richard talking. They're planning something big. They're going to try to force your hand. We invited Maria in and she told us everything she'd heard. Victoria and Richard had been discussing plans to start fining us for various alleged violations, not just on the empty lot, but on our main property too. They were going to make our lives miserable until we gave in. They mentioned something about a special assessment for community improvements, Maria added. They're planning to target just your section of the neighborhood. The fees would be astronomical. Dad's jaw clenched. They can't do that. It's harassment. Actually, Uncle Frank interjected, this is good news. They're getting sloppy, desperate. The more they try to pressure you, the more evidence we have of their bad faith actions. That afternoon, we received another letter from the HOA. This one detailed a list of supposed violations on our main property. Everything from improper hedge height to unauthorized shade of white on our trim. The fines totaled over $5,000. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore, Mom said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. What if we can't fight them? What if they just keep piling on fines until we have to give in? Uncle Frank put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Jennifer, trust me, every fine they levy, every threat they make, it's just more ammunition for us. I've already filed that injunction to stop any sale of the property. Now we're going to go on the offensive. He pulled out his phone and made a call. John, Frank Thompson here. Remember that HOA corruption story you were looking for? I've got something better. How'd you like to expose a systematic property theft scheme? John Peterson, it turned out, was a journalist for the local newspaper who'd been investigating suspicious property dealings in the area. Our case might be exactly what he needed to blow the whole thing wide open. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. John interviewed us extensively, digging into every detail of Victoria and Richard's pressure campaign. Other neighbors, emboldened by our stand, began coming forward with their own stories of HOA harassment and suspicious property dealings. The Millers revealed they'd been pressured to sell their side lot last year, but had refused. The Patels shared documentation of excessive fines that mysteriously disappeared when they agreed to sell their rental property to one of Richard's recommended buyers. Even the Wilsons, who'd always kept to themselves, admitted they'd been approached about their corner lot. It's a pattern, John explained as he sat at our kitchen table, reviewing everyone's statements. They identify desirable properties, create pressure through the HOA, then swoop in with lowball offers through their development company. It's technically legal, or at least it operates in a gray area, but it's absolutely unethical. Uncle Frank was building our legal case simultaneously. We're not just fighting the sale of your lot anymore, he explained. We're going after them for abuse of power, harassment, and possible racketeering. They've been using the HOA as a personal property acquisition tool. But Victoria wasn't going down without a fight. That evening, we received notice of an emergency HOA meeting. The topic: a vote on new bylaws that would give the board even more power over property sales and development. They're trying to change the rules to make their actions legal, Uncle Frank mused, reviewing the proposed changes. But this just proves they know what they're doing isn't right. Dad looked exhausted but determined. So what's our next move? Uncle Frank's eyes twinkled. We're going to that meeting. and we're bringing reinforcements. It's time to show Victoria and Richard that they're not the only ones who know how to play hardball. Looking at the determination on everyone's faces, I realized this wasn't just about our lot anymore. This was about standing up to bullies who'd been taking advantage of our community for too long. The real question was, would enough of our neighbors stand with us when the time came? The next few days felt like being in a pressure cooker. Every time we looked out our windows, we'd see Victoria or one of her HOA cronies walking past our house, taking notes or snapping pictures. They were documenting every blade of grass, every paint chip, anything they could use against us. But we weren't sitting idle. We were preparing for war. Uncle Frank had practically moved into our dining room, which had transformed into a makeshift war room. Papers covered every surface, laptops hummed constantly, and a steady stream of neighbors came through to share their stories and evidence. "Look at this pattern," Uncle Frank said one morning, spreading out a map of our neighborhood. He'd marked all the properties that Silverleaf Development had attempted to acquire over the past 2 years. They're not just picking random lots. They're creating a corridor. But why? Dad leaned over the map, his medical mind picking up the pattern instantly. They're connecting to the main road. Every property they've targeted creates a direct path to Highland Avenue. That's when John Peterson, who'd been working with us daily, snapped his fingers. The new shopping complex. The city council approved. It last month. These lots would create perfect access to the development site. Mom gasped. So this isn't just about flipping properties. They're trying to piece together land for commercial access. Bingo! Uncle Frank smiled grimly. And I bet if we dig deeper, we'll find connections between Silverleaf and that shopping complex development. John was already typing furiously on his laptop. Got it! Silverleaf's parent company, Reynolds Commercial Properties. Wait a minute. Reynolds? Victoria's husband's company, I added, remembering the gossip Maria had shared about Victoria's family being in real estate development. The pieces were falling into place, but we needed more than just theories. We needed solid evidence. That's when the Clarks from 2 streets over brought us something interesting. We found these in our attic, Robert Clark said, placing a box of old HOA documents on our table. Nancy's father was on the board 10 years ago. He kept everything. Uncle Frank dove into the documents like a kid on Christmas morning. What he found was gold. The original HOA covenant had specific protections against commercial development. Any attempt to convert residential property for commercial use required a 90% vote from all homeowners, not just the board. They can't do it, Uncle Frank declared triumphantly. Even if they managed to buy every property in their corridor, they couldn't legally convert it without community approval. That's why they've been so secretive, Dad realized. If people knew the real plan, they'd never get the votes. But our investigation had attracted attention. That evening, a black luxury car pulled up in front of our house. A man in an expensive suit stepped out. James Davidson, the CEO of Silverleaf Development himself. "Mr. Anderson," he called out as Dad was getting home from his shift. "Do you have a moment? I think we got off on the wrong foot here." Dad glanced at Uncle Frank, who nodded slightly. "Know your enemy." Inside our living room, Davidson tried to play good cop. "Look, I understand there's been some miscommunication. We're not the bad guys here. We're trying to bring progress to this neighborhood. Jobs, economic growth, increased property values. By stealing people's land?" I couldn't help but interject from my spot on the stairs. Davidson's practiced smile didn't waver. "Nobody's stealing anything. We're offering fair market value plus a premium. Your family could make a very nice profit here." Dad's voice was steel. "Our land isn't for sale. At any price." "Everyone has a price, Mr. Anderson." Davidson's smile turned cold. "And fighting this will cost you far more than taking our offer. Ask yourself, is one empty lot worth risking everything over?" Uncle Frank stepped forward. "Is threatening my family worth risking your entire development over, Mr. Davidson?" because that's what you're doing." Davidson's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Mr. Thompson. You don't want to make enemies of people like us." "No," Uncle Frank replied calmly. "You don't want to make enemies of people like us. People who know the law, who have evidence of your schemes, and who aren't afraid to use it." After Davidson left, we had an emergency family meeting. The stakes were clearly higher than we'd imagined. "They're getting nervous," Uncle Frank observed. "That visit wasn't just a threat. It was a sign we're getting close to something big." Mom looked worried. "Should we be concerned about their threats? They seem powerful." "That's exactly why we can't back down," Dad replied. "If we give in, they'll just keep doing this to other families." John Peterson arrived later that evening with more news. He'd been digging into Silverleaf's other developments. "You're not their first victims," he explained, spreading out documents. "They've done this in 3 other communities. Same pattern. Use the HOA to pressure homeowners, buy properties below market value, then flip them for commercial development. But here's the interesting part. In each case, they had someone on the inside, someone on the HOA board." "Victoria," Mum said quietly. "Exactly. But here's where they messed up. Victoria bought her house here 6 months before she ran for HOA president, and guess who sold her the house at a massive discount?" "Silverleaf," Dad answered. "Through a shell company," John confirmed. "They planted her here. This whole thing was planned from the start." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about our lot anymore. It was about exposing a systematic scheme to defraud entire communities. Uncle Frank was already on his phone. "We need to move fast. The emergency HOA meeting is in 2 days. That's our chance to blow this whole thing wide open." We spent the next day preparing. Uncle Frank coordinated with other homeowners, gathering affidavits and evidence. John worked on his exposé, making sure every detail was legally bulletproof. Dad and Mom reached out to every neighbor they could trust, building support for the coming confrontation. The night before the meeting, we gathered in our living room, the Andersons, Uncle Frank, John, and our core group of supporting neighbors. The atmosphere was tense but determined. "Tomorrow," Uncle Frank addressed the group, "we're not just fighting for one lot, we're fighting for our entire community. They think they can bully us into submission, but they're about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating ordinary people." Looking around that room, seeing the determination on everyone's faces, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole nightmare began. Hope. We weren't just victims anymore. We were warriors preparing for battle. The morning of the emergency HOA meeting dawned clear and cold. Our house buzzed with activity from sunrise. Uncle Frank arrived early, carrying boxes of documents and his laptop. John Peterson was right behind him, armed with his own evidence and a photographer from the newspaper. The Millers, Patels, and several other neighbors gathered in our living room for a final strategy session. "Remember," Uncle Frank addressed the group, "we need to stay calm and professional. No matter what they say or do, we stick to the facts. We have the truth on our side, and that's our strongest weapon." Mom was stress baking in the kitchen, filling the house with the smell of chocolate chip cookies. "Therefore, after the meeting," she said, but we all knew it was her way of coping with anxiety. Dad sat at the kitchen table, reviewing his notes one last time. He'd taken the day off from the hospital for this. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community center. By 6:30, the parking lot was already full. It seemed like the entire neighborhood had turned out. As we walked in, I could feel the tension in the air. Victoria Reynolds stood at the front of the room with Richard Bennett and the rest of the HOA board, looking confident and composed in her expensive suit. "She thinks she's got this in the bag," Uncle Frank whispered to Dad. "That's about to change." The meeting started precisely at 7 p.m. Victoria called for order, her voice carrying that practiced authority she loved to wield. We're here tonight to discuss important changes to our community bylaws, she began, smiling that fake smile of hers. These changes are necessary for the continued growth and prosperity of our neighborhood. That's when Uncle Frank stood up. Before we proceed, I believe there are some matters that need to be addressed regarding the current board's conduct. Victoria's smile flickered slightly. Mr. Thompson, we have an agenda to follow. If you have concerns, they can be addressed during the general discussion period. I think, Dad stood up next to Uncle Frank, that these matters are directly relevant to the proposed bylaw changes. In fact, they're the real reason for them. Richard Bennett leaned forward. Mr. Anderson, if this is about your lot again, this is about every lot, John Peterson's voice rang out as he stood. This is about a systematic attempt to defraud this entire community. The room erupted in murmurs. Victoria banged her gavel, trying to maintain control. These are serious accusations, Mr. Peterson. I hope you can back them up. Oh, we can, Uncle Frank smiled, pulling out his laptop and connecting it to the projector. Let's start with this. The screen lit up with a complex web of corporate connections, all leading back to Silverleaf Development and Reynolds Commercial Properties. Gasps filled the room as people began to understand what they were seeing. This, Uncle Frank pointed, is the real reason for tonight's meeting. These bylaw changes aren't about community improvement. They're about making it easier for certain parties to acquire property for commercial development. Victoria's face had gone pale, but she tried to maintain composure. These are baseless conspiracy theories. We're here to discuss legitimate community improvements, like the shopping complex, John interrupted, projecting his own documents. The one that your husband's company is developing, the one that needs a direct access route through our neighborhood. The room erupted again. Victoria banged her gavel desperately, but she was losing control of the meeting. Let's talk about how you became HOA president, Uncle Frank continued. Specifically, let's discuss the interesting circumstances surrounding your home purchase. That's when Victoria snapped. This is outrageous. I will not stand here and be accused. Then sit down, Maria Sanchez stood up. Because we're just getting started. For the next hour, Uncle Frank and John methodically laid out the entire scheme. The property acquisitions, the connection to the shopping complex, the fabricated violations, all of it. They had documents, testimonies, and even recordings of conversations between board members discussing their plans. The final blow came when Uncle Frank revealed the original HOA covenant protecting against commercial development. Even if they managed to buy every property they wanted, he explained to the stunned room, they couldn't legally convert it without a 90% community vote. These bylaw changes they're proposing tonight, they're trying to remove that protection. Victoria and Richard sat in stunned silence as neighbor after neighbor stood up to share their stories of harassment and pressure from the board. The Patels described the mysterious fines that disappeared when they agreed to sell. The Wilsons talked about the threats they'd received about their corner lot. This stops tonight, Dad declared, standing to address the room. We're calling for an immediate vote to remove the current board and elect new leadership. Victoria finally found her voice. You can't do this. You have no authority. Actually, Uncle Frank interrupted, according to Section 5 of the HOA Charter, any member can call for a vote of no confidence if there's evidence of board misconduct. I'd say we have plenty of evidence. The vote wasn't even close. By an overwhelming majority, the community voted to remove Victoria, Richard, and the entire board. As they stormed out of the meeting, Victoria turned to Dad. This isn't over, she hissed. You have no idea what you're dealing with. No, Dad replied calmly. You have no idea who you are dealing with. We're not just homeowners. We're a community, and we stand together. The aftermath was immediate. John's story ran in the next day's paper, exposing the entire scheme. The district attorney's office announced an investigation into Silverleaf Development and the HOA board's activities. Victoria and Richard's real estate licenses were suspended pending investigation. But the real victory wasn't just exposing the corruption, it was watching our community come together. People who had barely spoken to each other before were now united in purpose. The new HOA board, elected that night, immediately passed resolutions strengthening protections against commercial development and ensuring transparency in all future dealings. As we walked home that night, surrounded by celebrating neighbors, Mum squeezed Dad's hand. "We did it," she whispered. "We all did it," Dad replied, looking around at our community. "Together." But even as we celebrated, we knew this wasn't really the end. Victoria's threat still hung in the air, and Silverleaf Development wouldn't give up their plans easily. They had too much money invested, too much at stake. The days following the emergency HOA meeting felt almost surreal. Our neighborhood had transformed overnight from a collection of individual households into a tight-knit community united by our shared victory. People stopped to chat on their evening walks, organized impromptu block parties, and genuinely looked out for each other. But beneath this newfound harmony, we could all feel something brewing. "It's too quiet," Uncle Frank said one evening, sitting on our front porch with Dad. They'd made a habit of these evening strategy sessions, knowing that Silverleaf wouldn't simply walk away from their multi-million-dollar development plans. "Victoria and Richard haven't made a single public statement since the meeting." Dad nodded, sipping his coffee. "The district attorney's investigation seems to be moving slowly too, almost like something's holding it back." Inside, Mom was hosting an informal neighborhood watch meeting. After Victoria's threat, our neighbors had organized rotating patrols to keep an eye on each other's properties. The Millers, Patels, and several other families sat in our living room, coordinating schedules. "They've been seen around Highland Avenue," Mrs. Miller reported, marking a spot on our community map. "Victoria and some men in suits taking measurements and photos." "They're still planning something," Maria Sanchez added. "My cousin works at City Hall, and she says Silverleaf's lawyers have been there almost daily, meeting with various departments." John Peterson, who'd become a regular fixture in our lives, burst through the door, waving a stack of papers. "You need to see this," he said, spreading them across the coffee table. "They've filed new development plans with the city. They're trying to bypass the HOA entirely." The plans showed a modified version of their original shopping complex, with a different access route that would require condemning several properties through eminent domain. Our lot was still in their crosshairs, but now they were trying to use city regulations instead of HOA pressure. "Can they do that?" Mom asked, her voice trembling slightly. "They can try," Uncle Frank replied, coming in from the porch. "But eminent domain requires proving public benefit and paying fair market value. It's a much harder route than their original plan." That's when Tommy, my little brother, who'd been unusually quiet lately, spoke up. "What about the salamanders?" We all turned to look at him. "And what salamanders?" Dad asked. "In the creek behind our lot," Tommy explained. "My science teacher says they're a protected species. We've been studying local ecosystems, and I've seen them there." Uncle Frank's eyes lit up. "Tommy, you might have just given us exactly what we need. John, can you get an environmental specialist out here?" The next few days were a flurry of activity. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a local environmental scientist, confirmed Tommy's discovery. The creek running behind our property was indeed home to a population of endangered salamanders. This automatically triggered environmental protection regulations that would make any commercial development nearly impossible. "This is bigger than just stopping the shopping complex," Dr. Martinez explained, photographing the salamanders. "This entire area could be designated as a protected habitat. Victoria must have gotten wind of our discovery because she showed up at our door the next morning, looking decidedly less polished than usual. "Let's be reasonable," she said, her voice strained. "Whatever you think you found, I'm sure we can come to an arrangement. Name your price." Dad stood in the doorway, blocking her view of the house. "Not everything has a price, Victoria. Some things are worth protecting." "Don't be naive," she snapped. "Do you really think a few salamanders can stop this development? Do you know how much money is involved here? Do you know how much jail time is involved in trying to bribe someone to ignore environmental regulations?" Uncle Frank called out from behind Dad, "Because I'd be happy to explain it to you." Victoria's face contorted with rage. "You're making a massive mistake. All of you. This development is happening one way or another." As she stormed off, we noticed a sleek black SUV parked down the street, its tinted windows concealing whoever was watching our house. "They're getting desperate," Uncle Frank observed. "That makes them dangerous." He was right. The next morning, we woke up to find the creek had been tampered with. Someone had dumped chemicals in the water overnight, trying to destroy the salamander habitat. Thankfully, the Wilsons, who were on neighborhood watch that night, had witnessed two men in dark clothing near the creek and called the police. The officer who responded, Michael Hayes, turned out to be an old friend of Uncle Frank's. "This isn't just vandalism," he said, taking samples of the contaminated water. "This is environmental terrorism. We're bringing in the EPA." The local news picked up the story, and suddenly our quiet neighborhood battle was making headlines. Developer accused of environmental sabotage in property dispute. Reporters camped out on our street, trying to get interviews with anyone involved. Through it all, our community stood stronger than ever. When Silverleaf's lawyers tried to challenge the environmental protection claim, our neighbors raised money to hire expert witnesses. When mysterious men in suits started photographing our houses, the neighborhood watch expanded its patrols. When pressure from City Hall threatened to override the protection order, hundreds of community members showed up at the city council meeting to protest. "This isn't just about salamanders anymore," John told us one evening, as we watched another news crew set up outside. "This is about regular people standing up to corporate bullies. You're becoming a symbol." Mom looked worried. "We never wanted to be symbols. We just wanted to protect our home." "Sometimes," Uncle Frank said quietly, "protecting your home means fighting battles bigger than yourself." But even as our community celebrated each small victory, we could sense something building. Victoria's threat still hung in the air, and Silverleaf's resources seemed endless. They were pulling strings we couldn't see, making moves we couldn't anticipate. "They're planning something big," Dad said one night, staring out at the creek that had become the centerpiece of our battle. "All these little attacks, they're just distractions. They're setting us up for something else." He was right, of course. None of us could have predicted what would happen next, or how far Silverleaf would go to get what they wanted. But that's a story that still gives me chills to think about. The calm after our environmental discovery didn't last long. It started with small things at first, so subtle that if we weren't already on high alert, we might have missed them. Our mail began arriving late or sometimes not at all. Internet service became spotty. Strange cars would park outside our house for hours, then drive away when approached. "They're trying to wear us down," Uncle Frank observed one morning, watching. Another unmarked car cruise slowly past our house. Classic intimidation tactics. But what happened next showed us just how far Silverleaf Development was willing to go. It was a regular Tuesday morning when Dad got the call from the hospital. Administration. "Someone filed a complaint," he told us that evening, his face drawn with worry. "They're claiming I've been writing fraudulent prescriptions. I'm suspended pending investigation." Mom gasped. "That's ridiculous. You've been at that hospital for 15 years. The timing is no coincidence, Uncle Frank growled, already pulling out his phone to call his contacts. They're attacking our livelihoods now. He was right. The next day, Mum's small photography business received multiple calls cancelling upcoming sessions. Clients cited concerning reviews they'd seen online, reviews that hadn't existed the day before. John Peterson arrived at our house that afternoon with more disturbing news. They're doing this systematically, he explained, spreading out his research. Everyone who spoke out at the HOA meeting is being targeted. The Miller's landscaping business lost 3 major contracts. The Patel's restaurant got hit with a surprise health inspection. They're going after anyone who stands with you. Maria Sanchez rushed over, clutching her tablet. You need to see this, she said, pulling up a local news website. The headline made my stomach drop. Local doctor under investigation for prescription fraud. Environmental protection claim questioned. They're trying to discredit us, Dad said quietly. Make it look like we can't be trusted about the salamanders because we're not trustworthy people. That's when we got the call from Dr. Martinez, the environmental scientist who'd verified Tommy's salamander discovery. Her voice was shaking. They got to my university, she said. Someone sent emails claiming I falsified research data. They're threatening to pull my grant funding. I can't help you anymore. I'm sorry. It felt like the walls were closing in. But instead of breaking us, these attacks had an unexpected effect. They made our community even stronger. The Hunters, who owned a local tech company, offered Dad a temporary position while his hospital situation was sorted out. Mrs. Patel started a social media campaign to counter the fake reviews of Mom's photography business. Even the local high school environmental club, inspired by Tommy's discovery, organized daily creek monitoring to document and protect the salamander habitat. They think they can isolate us, Mom said during an emergency community meeting in our living room, but they're just showing everyone exactly who they are. That's when we discovered something interesting. Steve Miller, whose landscaping company had lost those contracts, did some digging. All 3 cancellations came from companies owned by shell corporations, he explained, showing us the documentation. And guess who those shell corporations trace back to? Silverleaf, John answered, already typing notes. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. Uncle Frank was reviewing everything with his lawyer's eye. This is good, he said, surprising us all. The more blatant they get, the more evidence we have. They're acting like they're above the law, but they're really just giving us more ammunition. But Silverleaf wasn't done. The next morning, a moving truck pulled up to Victoria's house. We watched as she supervised the loading of her furniture. Running away? Maria called out as she passed by on her morning walk. Victoria's smile was cold. Oh no, dear. Just making room for the new owners. You'll be seeing a lot of changes around here very soon. Within days, we understood what she meant. One by one, houses around the neighborhood began selling, all to different buyers, but all somehow connected to Silverleaf's web of shell companies. They were buying up the neighborhood piece by piece. They're trying to take control through property ownership, Uncle Frank explained. If they own enough houses, they can stack the next HOA board election. They might not be able to force us out directly, but they can make our lives impossible through legal means. The tension in the neighborhood reached a breaking point when construction equipment appeared on the vacant lot next to the creek. They had no permits, no approval, but they were clearly preparing for something. Dad confronted the workers. You can't build here. This is a protected habitat. The foreman just shrugged. We're just doing prep work. Talk to management if you've got complaints. That's when Officer Hayes showed up, lights flashing. Actually, he said, stepping out of his patrol car, you'll be talking to me. This is a protected site, and you're in violation of multiple environmental regulations. The workers left, but we all knew they'd be back. This was just another test, another form of pressure. "They're trying to force us to make a mistake," Uncle Frank warned during our nightly strategy session. "Get us to react emotionally, do something they can use against us." He was right. The next day, a process server arrived at our door with a thick stack of papers. Silverleaf was suing us for defamation, claiming our environmental concerns were a malicious attempt to block legitimate development. "This lawsuit is ridiculous," Uncle Frank said after reviewing the documents. "But that's not the point. They're trying to drown us in legal fees, wear us down with court appearances, but they'd underestimated our community once again." That evening, our living room was packed with neighbors, all offering to help. The Wilsons started a legal defense fund. The Clarks, who owned a local print shop, offered to handle all our copying and document preparation. Even Mr. Peterson from the newspaper pledged to cover the story and keep the public informed. "Here's what they don't understand," Dad addressed the crowd. "They think money is power, but real power comes from people standing together, supporting each other, fighting for what's right." As I looked around at all our neighbors, people who'd barely known each other months ago, I realized he was right. Every attack Silverleaf launched just made us stronger, more united, but we knew the real battle was still coming. Victoria's smirk as she moved out, the construction equipment waiting like sleeping giants, the mysterious new neighbors moving in, it all pointed to something bigger brewing. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was getting ready for school when I heard Mum call out from the kitchen, her voice tight with alarm. "David, you need to see this." We all rushed to the kitchen window. A fleet of construction vehicles was rolling down our street. Bulldozers, dump trucks, excavators, more equipment than we'd ever seen before. They weren't heading for the creek this time. Instead, they stopped right in front of our house. James Davidson himself stepped out of a luxury SUV, flanked by Victoria Reynolds and a group of men in expensive suits. One of them held what looked like official documents. "Here we go," Uncle Frank muttered, already reaching for his phone. "Everyone remember what we discussed. Stay calm. Record everything." Dad met them at the front door before they could knock. "Can I help you?" His voice was steel wrapped in politeness. Davidson's smile was all predator. "Mr. Anderson, we have some paperwork you need to see." He nodded to one of the suits, who stepped forward with the documents. "The City Council has approved our revised development plan. Your property has been designated for eminent domain." Mom's hands flew to her mouth. I felt my stomach drop. Even Uncle Frank looked shocked. "That's impossible," Dad said, scanning the papers. "There was no public hearing, no notification." "Emergency session," Victoria smirked, "called specifically to address the urgent need for economic development in this area. Quite legal, I assure you." "Legal?" Uncle Frank stepped forward. "We'll see about that. The Environmental Protection Order has been reviewed and overturned." Davidson cut in smoothly. "Your amateur salamander discovery doesn't outweigh the public benefit of this development. We have crews ready to begin work immediately." As if on cue, the construction vehicles roared to life. Workers began unloading equipment. A survey team started marking lines on our property. "You can't do this," Mum's voice shook with anger. "This is our home." "Actually, Mrs. Anderson, we can, and we are." Davidson's fake sympathy was worse than Victoria's smirk. "But we're prepared to be generous. Accept our offer now, and we'll give you 48 hours to vacate. Fight us and, well, the city has authorized immediate possession." That's when we noticed more vehicles arriving. Police cars, but not regular patrol units. These were tactical vehicles, officers in riot gear stepping out. "You called in the riot squad?" Dad's voice rose in disbelief. "For a family protecting their home?" "Standard procedure for potential civil unrest," Victoria said sweetly. "We've heard concerning rumors about possible resistance." But Davidson and his cronies had overlooked something crucial. While they'd been focused on intimidating us, our neighbors had been gathering. The Millers, Patels, Wilsons, and dozens of others now stood on their front lawns, phones raised, recording everything. John Peterson was there with his camera crew, broadcasting live. Maria Sanchez's voice rang out clear and strong. "Hey, Victoria, how much did it cost to buy the city council?" That hit a nerve. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "Keep recording," she snapped. "You'll make excellent evidence when we sue for harassment." Davidson tried to regain control of the situation. "This is a legal city action. Anyone interfering will be arrested." That's when we heard sirens. More vehicles were arriving, but these weren't with Davidson's crew. Officer Hayes led a convoy of county sheriff vehicles, followed by what looked like state police. "Actually," Hayes said, stepping out of his car, "this action is suspended pending a state investigation." He held up his own documents. "The state Attorney General's office has some concerns about the emergency council meeting, specifically about certain financial transactions that preceded it." Davidson's confidence wavered for the first time. "We have city approval, which means nothing if it was obtained through corruption," a new voice called out. A woman in a sharp suit walked up, flanked by FBI agents. "I'm Special Agent Roberts. We have warrants to seize all documents related to this development project and the council meeting that approved it." The next hour was chaos. FBI agents began serving warrants. State police ordered the construction crews to stand down. The riot police, looking uncomfortable, retreated to their vehicles. Victoria was nearly hyperventilating. "You can't do this! Do you know who my husband is?" "Yes, Mrs. Reynolds, we do." Agent Roberts smiled coldly. "That's precisely why we're here." Davidson tried to slip away to his SUV, but two FBI agents intercepted him. "Mr. Davidson, we'll need you to come with us. We have some questions about certain offshore accounts." As Davidson was led away, Uncle Frank turned to Dad with a grim smile. "Remember when I said their desperation would make them sloppy? Looks like they got really sloppy with those council bribes." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger. People were streaming in from all over the neighborhood, drawn by the commotion. When Victoria and Davidson were driven away in separate police vehicles, a spontaneous cheer erupted. But we knew it wasn't over. The construction equipment still loomed over our property, a reminder of how close we'd come to losing everything. The workers stood around uncertainly, waiting for instructions that wouldn't come. Officer Hayes approached us, looking both relieved and worried. "The state investigation will take time. They'll probably try to fight this in court." "Let them," Uncle Frank replied. "The longer this drags out, the more evidence we'll find. I bet those construction crews have some interesting stories about other projects they've done for Silverleaf." He was right. Over the next few days, as news of the FBI investigation spread, people started coming forward. Former city officials, contractors, even former Silverleaf employees, all with stories of corruption and illegal dealings. The days following the FBI raid were intense. Our house became an unofficial command center for the investigation, with a steady stream of agents, investigators, and witnesses coming and going. The living room looked more like a detective's office than a family space, with evidence boards, timelines, and stacks of documents everywhere. Special Agent Roberts made herself comfortable at our kitchen table, coordinating with Uncle Frank and John Peterson as they pieced together Silverleaf's web of corruption. "It's like peeling an onion," she explained, spreading out financial records. Every layer we pull back reveals something more sinister beneath. The first bombshell dropped when they traced the money used to buy Victoria's house. Not only had Silverleaf supplied the funds through a shell company, but they'd been doing the same thing in communities across 3 states. "They plant their people in HOAs," John explained, adding another string to his evidence board. then use those positions to force out homeowners and acquire property for pennies on the dollar. But the real shock came when Agent Roberts followed, the money trail from the city council meeting. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of transactions. The bribes didn't just go to council members. They were paying off people at every level: planning commission, zoning board, even environmental inspectors. Dad, who'd finally been cleared of the false prescription fraud allegations, shook his head in disgust. How did they get away with this for so long? "Money," Uncle Frank answered grimly. "And the fact that most people can't afford to fight back. They pick their targets carefully: working families, elderly homeowners, people who can't sustain a long legal battle." The investigation expanded rapidly. FBI agents interviewed every homeowner who'd been pressured to sell in the last 5 years. The Patels shared security footage of late-night meetings between Victoria and Richard Bennett in the restaurant parking lot. The Millers provided documentation of mysterious property assessments that had dramatically undervalued homes Silverleaf wanted to acquire. But the biggest break came from an unexpected source. Tommy, who'd been spending time at the creek, documenting the salamanders for his science project, made another discovery. "Dad, Uncle Frank, look what I found." He came running in one afternoon, clutching what looked like old pipes. Dr. Martinez, who'd been reinstated at her university after the FBI cleared her of any wrongdoing, examined Tommy's find. "These are industrial drainage pipes," she said, her face darkening. "And based on the markings, they're from one of Silverleaf's previous developments." Further investigation revealed something horrifying. Silverleaf hadn't just been building shopping centers. They'd been deliberately routing industrial runoff into protected watersheds, destroying wildlife habitats to force environmental protection orders to be lifted. "This isn't just fraud anymore," Agent Roberts said, photographing the evidence. "This is systematic environmental destruction for profit. The EPA is going to have a field day with this." The investigation also revealed why they'd been so desperate to get our specific property. The creek that ran behind our lot wasn't just home to endangered salamanders. It was part of a crucial watershed that fed into the city's main reservoir. If they could contaminate this creek, Dr. Martinez explained, they could force the city to rezone the entire area. The public benefit they claimed for eminent domain wasn't about shopping centers. It was about controlling the water supply. As more evidence emerged, people from other communities started reaching out. John's phone rang constantly with tips and stories from families who'd faced similar pressure from Silverleaf-controlled HOAs. "They've been doing this for years," he said, adding another pin to his map of affected communities. "It's not just about property values or development. They're trying to control entire regions through water rights and infrastructure." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Victoria and Richard weren't just corrupt HOA officials. They were part of a massive criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple states. But even as the investigation gained momentum, we faced new challenges. Silverleaf's lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to block the investigation. Mysterious accidents started happening to key witnesses. Brake failures, power outages, computer crashes. "They're getting desperate," Uncle Frank warned during a strategy session. "That makes them dangerous." He was right. One night we woke to the smell of smoke. Someone had tried to set fire to our garage, where we'd been storing copies of all our evidence. Thankfully, the Wilson's son, who was on neighborhood watch that night, spotted the arsonist and called 911. The FBI installed security cameras around our property after that. Agent Roberts assigned protective details to key witnesses. Our quiet suburban neighborhood started looking more like a police compound. But instead of intimidating us, these attacks only strengthened our resolve. The community came together in ways we'd never seen before. People took turns guarding the creek. The local nature society organized regular salamander monitoring sessions. The high school environmental club started a social media campaign that went viral. "See, this is what they don't understand," Mom said one evening as we watched neighbors patrol the street. "They think fear and money are the only powers that matter, but they've never faced the power of a united community." The investigation was building towards something big. Agent Roberts spent more time on the phone with Washington. More FBI agents arrived. Even the media started paying attention, with national news crews setting up outside our house. "We're close to something," Uncle Frank said, reviewing new evidence. "They wouldn't be fighting this hard if we weren't about to expose something huge." He was right, of course. What we'd uncovered so far was just the tip of the iceberg. The real bombshell was still to come, and when it hit, it would shake the foundations of not just our community, but communities across the country. The morning of the federal hearing arrived with an atmosphere of electric tension. The courthouse steps were crowded with news crews, protesters, and curious onlookers. Our entire neighborhood had shown up to support us, wearing Save Our Community t-shirts that the clerks had printed. Inside the courtroom, the tension was even thicker. Victoria and Richard sat with their lawyers on one side, while James Davidson and other Silverleaf executives occupied another section. They all looked confident, despite being under federal investigation. That should have been our first clue that something was off. "They look too smug," Uncle Frank whispered to Dad. "They know something we don't." Agent Roberts met us outside the courtroom, her face tight with concern. "We've got a problem," she said, pulling us aside. "Someone's been tampering with our witnesses. 3 key testimonies were just withdrawn." Before we could process this, John Peterson rushed up, looking pale. "You need to see this," he said, holding up his tablet. The headline made my stomach drop. "Federal judge assigned to Silverleaf case has previous ties to developer." "It gets worse," Agent Roberts added. "The state attorney general's office is suddenly backing off. Someone's applying pressure from way up the chain." Dad's face hardened. "So that's their game. They're not just buying local officials, they've got people in high places." The hearing started, but it quickly became clear this wasn't going to be the exposé we'd hoped for. The judge seemed dismissive of our evidence, accepting every objection from Silverleaf's lawyers while shutting down our witnesses. "Your Honor," Uncle Frank argued, "we have documented proof of systematic corruption, environmental violations, and fraudulent property acquisitions." "What you have, Mr. Thompson," the judge replied coldly, "is a collection of circumstantial evidence and unsubstantiated allegations. This court needs facts, not conspiracy theories." That's when Tommy, who'd been sitting quietly beside Mom, stood up. "I have facts," he called out, his voice cracking with nervousness but determination. The judge peered over his glasses. "Young man, this is a federal court, not a school presentation." "But I have proof," Tommy insisted. He pulled out his tablet, the one he'd been using to document the salamanders. "I've been recording everything that happens at the creek, including this." He pulled up a video that made the entire courtroom gasp. It showed Victoria and Richard meeting with construction workers late at night, planning the chemical dumping that had nearly destroyed the salamander habitat. But that wasn't all. They were discussing similar operations at other sites, mentioning names and dates that matched perfectly with our investigation. The judge tried to shut it down, but Tommy had already sent the video to every reporter in the room. Within minutes, it was streaming live on social media. Then Maria Sanchez stood up. "I have proof too." She played a recording of Victoria discussing bribes with city officials. More neighbors followed, each presenting evidence they'd been gathering. Quietly, for months, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Silverleaf's lawyers huddled with their clients, while reporters rushed to file their stories. The judge banged his gavel uselessly, trying to regain control. That's when James Davidson made his fatal mistake. He stood up and shouted, None of this matters. Do you really think your pathetic little evidence can touch us? We own this town. We own this state. The FBI agents in the room moved instantly, but Davidson wasn't finished. In his rage, he began listing names, judges, politicians, officials, who were all part of Silverleaf's network. It was like watching a man detonate his own bomb. Agent Roberts was already on her phone, calling in reinforcements. Victoria tried to flee, but was stopped by Officer Hayes at the door. Richard fainted dead away. "Well," Uncle Frank said with a grim smile, "I guess sometimes the bad guys do conveniently confess in public." The aftermath was explosive. The judge had to recuse himself. New indictments were issued hourly. The FBI's investigation expanded to include every name Davidson had mentioned, leading to a domino effect of resignations and arrests across 3 states. But the real victory came later that day, when we returned home to find our neighborhood celebrating. The construction equipment was gone. The creek was safe. Our community had stood together and won. "It's not over," Dad warned as we watched our neighbors celebrating on the lawn. "There will be more battles, more developers, more people trying to take advantage. But now we know how to fight back," Mom replied, squeezing his hand. "And more importantly, we know we're not alone." She was right. Our community had been transformed. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were a family, united by our struggle and strengthened by our victory. Tommy became a local hero. His salamander. Documentation turning him into a symbol of youth environmental activism. The creek was designated as a protected habitat, with our community appointed as its official guardians. Victoria and Richard faced federal charges, along with dozens of Silverleaf executives and corrupted officials. Davidson's public meltdown became a viral sensation used in law schools as an example of how not to behave in court. But the real change was in our community. The HOA was reformed with new bylaws protecting homeowners' rights. Regular town halls were established to ensure transparency in local development. Our story inspired other communities to stand up against corrupt developers and officials. "You know what the real lesson is here?" Uncle Frank said during our victory barbecue. "It's not about having the most money or the most power. It's about having the courage to stand together and fight for what's right." Oh, looking around at our celebrating neighbors, I realized he was absolutely right. We'd won because we'd stood united, because regular people had refused to be bullied or bought. What happened after our courtroom victory was something none of us could have predicted. Our story didn't just end with Silverleaf's downfall. It sparked a nationwide movement that would change how communities fought back against corporate corruption. It started with John Peterson's article going viral. "Small Town Takes Down Corporate Giant, the real story behind the Salamander Revolution," was picked up by major news outlets across the country. Suddenly, our phones were ringing non-stop with calls from other communities facing similar battles. "You won't believe what I just heard," Mom said one morning, hanging up from yet another call. A neighborhood in Oregon is dealing with almost exactly the same situation. Their HOA president suddenly changed all the rules, started pressuring people to sell. Uncle Frank had set up a makeshift office in our guest room to handle all the requests for help. "It's the same playbook everywhere," he explained, showing us a map dotted with pins representing different communities under siege. "These developers think they're untouchable because nobody knows how to fight back. But now we did know, and we were ready to share that knowledge." The Millers offered their landscaping company's office as a meeting space. Every weekend, representatives from different communities would come to learn our strategies. Dad and Uncle Frank would explain the legal aspects. Mom would share our documentation methods, and even Tommy would talk about the importance of environmental monitoring. "The key is evidence," Dad would explain to these groups. "They rely on operating in the shadows. When you shine a light on what they're doing, document everything. That's when they start making mistakes." Maria Sanchez started a YouTube channel. called Community Defense Network, sharing tips on how to spot developer schemes and organize neighborhood resistance. The Patels turned their restaurant into an unofficial community center, hosting strategy sessions over plates of butter chicken and naan. But it wasn't just about fighting developers. We were teaching communities how to come together, how to build the kind of unity that had helped us win our battle. "Look at what happened here," Mom would tell visiting groups, gesturing around our neighborhood. "Before all this, we barely knew our neighbors. Now we're family." That's your real strength, not just fighting the bad guys, but building something stronger together. The movement grew faster than we could have imagined. Communities started forming networks, sharing information and resources. When developers tried their usual tactics in one area, they'd find themselves facing organized resistance, armed with knowledge of their playbook. Then came the call that changed everything. "You need to turn on the news," John Peterson said one evening, his voice excited. "Channel 7, right now." We gathered around the TV to see James Davidson, the former CEO of Silverleaf, in handcuffs. The FBI had uncovered a nationwide network of corruption involving dozens of development companies, hundreds of local officials, and billions in fraudulent deals. "Your case broke it open," Agent Roberts told us later. Once Davidson started talking, the whole house of cards came down. We're looking at the biggest corporate corruption bust in decades. The revelations kept coming. Victoria and Richard hadn't just been corrupt HOA officials. They'd been part of a sophisticated network of corporate plants, placed in communities across the country to facilitate land grabs and development schemes. But the most satisfying moment came when we learned about the fate of our protected creek. The State Environmental Agency, now under new leadership, designated it as a model for community-managed conservation areas. Tommy's salamander documentation became part of the official record used in environmental science courses. "It's like a miracle," Dr. Martinez said during the dedication ceremony for the new creek conservation area. One community's stand against corruption ended up protecting ecosystems across the state. Our neighborhood had transformed too. The empty lots that Silverleaf had tried to seize were turned into community gardens. The Wilsons started a neighborhood watch training program that was adopted by communities nationwide. Even the new HOA became a model for democratic community governance. But with all the attention came new challenges. Corporate lawyers started showing up, trying to find ways to discredit our story. Social media trolls attempted to paint us as anti-development extremists. "They still don't get it," Dad said during one particularly heated community meeting. "This was never about stopping development. It was about stopping corruption, about communities having a say in their own future." He was right. Under the new HOA leadership, our neighborhood actually approved several development projects, but they were projects that benefited the community, planned with transparency and real public input. The most surprising change came in how other HOAs started approaching us for guidance. It started with John Peterson's article going viral. "Small town takes down corporate giant." The real story behind the salamander revolution was picked up by major news outlets across the country. Suddenly, our phones were ringing non-stop with calls from other communities facing similar battles. "You won't believe what I just heard," Mom said one morning, hanging up from yet another call. A neighborhood in Oregon is dealing with almost exactly the same situation. Their HOA president suddenly changed all the rules, started pressuring people to sell. Uncle Frank had set up a makeshift office in our guest room to handle all the requests for help. "It's the same playbook everywhere," he explained, showing us a map dotted with pins representing different communities under siege. "These developers think they're untouchable because nobody knows how to fight back. But now we did know, and we were ready to share that knowledge." The Millers offered their landscaping company's office as a meeting space. Every weekend, representatives from different communities would come to learn our strategies. Dad and Uncle. Frank would explain the legal aspects, Mom would share our documentation methods, and even Tommy would talk about the importance of environmental monitoring. The key is evidence, Dad would explain to these groups. They rely on operating in the shadows. When you shine a light on what they're doing, document everything, that's when they start making mistakes. Maria Sanchez started a YouTube channel called Community Defense Network, sharing tips on how to spot developer schemes and organize neighborhood resistance. The Patels turned their restaurant into an unofficial community center, hosting strategy sessions over plates of butter chicken and naan. But it wasn't just about fighting developers. We were teaching communities how to come together, how to build the kind of unity that had helped us win our battle. Look at what happened here, Mum would tell visiting groups, gesturing around our neighborhood. Before all this, we barely knew our neighbors. Now we're family. That's your real strength. Not just fighting the bad guys, but building something stronger together. The movement grew faster than we could have imagined. Communities started forming networks, sharing information and resources. When developers tried their usual tactics in one area, they'd find themselves facing organized resistance armed with knowledge of their playbook. Then came the call that changed everything. "You need to turn on the news," John Peterson said one evening, his voice excited. "Channel 7, right now." We gathered around the TV to see James Davidson, the former CEO of Silverleaf, in handcuffs. The FBI had uncovered a nationwide network of corruption involving dozens of development companies, hundreds of local officials, and billions in fraudulent deals. "Your case broke it open," Agent Roberts told us later. Once Davidson started talking, the whole house of cards came down. "We're looking at the biggest corporate corruption bust in decades." The revelations kept coming. Victoria and Richard hadn't just been corrupt HOA officials. They'd been part of a sophisticated network of corporate plants, placed in communities across the country to facilitate land grabs and development schemes. But the most satisfying moment came when we learned about the fate of our protected creek. The State Environmental Agency, now under new leadership, designated it as a model for community-managed conservation areas. Tommy's salamander documentation became part of the official record used in environmental science courses. "It's like a miracle," Dr. Martinez said during the dedication ceremony for the new creek conservation area. One community's stand against corruption ended up protecting ecosystems across the state. Our neighborhood had transformed too. The bay empty lots that Silverleaf had tried to seize were turned into community gardens. The Wilsons started a neighborhood watch training program that was adopted by communities nationwide. Even the new HOA became a model for democratic community governance. But with all the attention came new challenges. Corporate lawyers started showing up, trying to find ways to discredit our story. Social media trolls attempted to paint us as anti-development extremists. "They still don't get it," Dad said during one particularly heated community meeting. "This was never about stopping development. It was about stopping corruption, about communities having a say in their own future." He was right. Under the new HOA leadership, our neighborhood actually approved several development projects. But they were projects that benefited the community, planned with transparency and real public input. The most surprising change came in how other HOAs started approaching us for guidance. Victoria's old network of corrupt HOA presidents was being replaced by community leaders who actually cared about their neighborhoods. "It's like watching dominoes fall," Uncle Frank observed. "Every corrupted HOA that gets exposed and reformed weakens their whole system." As our story spread, more communities started finding their voice. The Salamander Revolution, as the media had dubbed it, became a symbol of grassroots resistance against corporate overreach. But this is just the beginning. Mom reminded us, during a family dinner. There are still developers out there, still communities being threatened. Our work isn't done. She was right, of course. The fight wasn't over. It was evolving. But now we had something we didn't have before: hope, knowledge, and a network of communities ready to stand together. 1 year after our courtroom victory, our neighborhood hosted a reunion unlike any other. Representatives from over 50 communities across the country gathered in our local park, all of them veterans of their own battles against corporate corruption, all inspired by our story. "I can't believe how much has changed," Mom said, watching the crowds mingle. The park that Silverleaf had once tried to destroy was now a protected community space, with the creek running clear and healthy through its heart. Tommy's salamanders had become local celebrities, their habitat a living symbol of our victory. The changes went far beyond our neighborhood. The FBI's investigation, sparked by our case, had led to the arrest of over 300 people involved in corporate land fraud schemes. James Davidson's dramatic courtroom confession had opened a floodgate of evidence that was still producing indictments. "Remember when we thought this was just about one greedy HOA president?" Dad laughed, helping set up tables for the community potluck. We had no idea how deep it really went. Victoria and Richard had both taken plea deals, turning states, evidence against bigger fish. Their testimony had helped expose a network of corruption that stretched across multiple states and industries. The final tally was staggering. Billions in fraudulent developments, hundreds of compromised officials, and countless communities affected. But the real victory wasn't in the arrests or indictments. It was in the change we could see around us. "Look at this," Uncle Frank said, showing us his laptop during the celebration. He'd been tracking the impact of our case across the country. In the past year, over 200 communities have successfully fought off predatory development schemes. They're using our playbook: documentation, community organization, environmental protection. The salamander strategy, as it had come to be known, had become a template for community resistance. Our methods of gathering evidence, building community support, and leveraging environmental protection laws were being taught in civic engagement workshops nationwide. John Peterson, whose coverage of our story had won him a prestigious journalism award, took the stage to address the gathered crowd. "A year ago, this was just one neighborhood fighting for survival," he began. "Today, it's a nationwide movement. You've shown that when communities stand together, no corporation is too big to challenge, no corruption too entrenched to expose." He was right. The movement had grown beyond anything we could have imagined. The Community Defense Network, started in our living room, now had chapters in every state. They provided legal support, shared intelligence about developer tactics, and helped communities organize effective resistance. But perhaps the most significant change was in how development itself was happening. The exposure of Silverleaf's corruption had led to new laws requiring community input and environmental impact studies for all major development projects. "The developers are still out there," Agent Roberts told us during the reunion. She'd become a regular visitor, keeping us updated on the ongoing investigations. But they're afraid now. They know communities are watching, documenting, ready to fight back. Tommy, now considered something of an expert on community environmental monitoring, had started a junior naturalist program that was being replicated in schools across the country. His salamander documentation methods had become part of a citizen science curriculum. "It's not just about stopping bad guys anymore," he explained to a group of visiting students. "It's about protecting what matters, about communities taking control of their own future." The reunion also brought news of victories from other communities. The Millers shared stories of neighborhoods that had successfully reformed their HOAs. The Patels talked about communities that had turned threatened spaces into protected habitats. Maria Sanchez's YouTube channel had evolved into a full-fledged community organizing platform, but we all knew the fight wasn't over. Even as we celebrated, new challenges were emerging. Bigger corporations, having learned from Silverleaf's mistakes, were developing more subtle methods of community manipulation. "They think they're being clever," Uncle Frank observed during a strategy session, using artificial intelligence to analyze community vulnerabilities, hiring social media influencers to shape public opinion. But they're forgetting one thing. You can't algorithm your way around human connection. He was right. The strength of our movement wasn't in our tactics or strategies, though those were important. It was in the bonds we'd formed, the trust we'd built, the communities we'd strengthened. As the sun set on our reunion celebration, we gathered for a final ceremony at the creek. Dr. Martinez, speaking on behalf of the environmental science community, announced the establishment of a new research center focused on community-based conservation. "What happened here wasn't just about saving some salamanders," she said. "It was about proving that when people come together to protect what they love, they can achieve extraordinary things." Looking around at all the faces, neighbors who'd become family, strangers who'd become allies, communities that had found their voice, I realized we'd built something far more powerful than any corporation's scheme. "You know what the real victory is?" Mom said, watching Tommy lead a group of kids on a salamander monitoring expedition. "It's not just that we stopped them, it's that we showed others how to stop them too." The legacy of our fight continues to grow. Every week brings news of another community standing up, another development scheme exposed, another victory for local democracy over corporate greed. As for our neighborhood, the creek still flows, the salamanders still thrive, and our community is stronger than ever. Victoria's old house has been turned into a community center where we teach others how to fight back against corruption and protect what matters. But most importantly, we've learned that no corporation, no matter how powerful, can stand against communities united in purpose and strengthened by trust. Want to see more stories of communities fighting back against corporate corruption? Ready to learn how you can protect your own neighborhood? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The revolution might have started with some salamanders, but it continues with people like you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.